most of you are here. We're so far behind schedule, I better start. And I hope I didn't make a mistake by scheduling or talking about the Old Testament right after lunch. Please try to stay awake, and I'll try to keep it interesting as well. So lecture 3 is about the failure of Old Testament sacrifice, but actually we're going to start with the origin of sacrifice as told in the Old Testament. This lecture will be following Old Testament sacrifice sort of from start to finish, from Genesis through the prophets, and see the complete arc there. But we had a question right before lunch about where sacrifice came from, and specifically the sacrifices of Cain and Abel, and what led them to sacrifice, and what did these sacrifices mean. So Genesis chapter 4 tells the story of Adam and Eve and their children, and sort of the beginnings of the human race. And I'll just read the quote. Adam knew his wife Eve, and after conceiving, she bore Cain, and said, I acquired a man through God's work. And she proceeded to bear his brother Abel. And Abel became a shepherd of sheep, and Cain was a tiller of the earth. And it happened after some days that Cain brought a sacrifice to the Lord from the fruits of the earth, and Abel himself brought a sacrifice from the firstborn of his sheep and from their suet. And suet, by the way, is like lard, but for cattle. Lard is for pigs, and suet is for cattle or sheep. Hard, really substantial fat. And it was always offered to God in the Old Testament. It was not eaten by human beings, but supposed to be offered to God. Okay, and God countenanced or looked favorably upon Abel and his gifts, but he disregarded Cain and his sacrifices. So one of the very first things we learn about right after Adam and Eve fell and were expelled from paradise, one of the very first things that happens is a pair of sacrifices. And the outcome of those sacrifices is one of the sort of fundamental steps in the progression of the human race. It's here at the beginning and shows the fundamental importance of sacrifice for humanity from then on. Now the question that was given before is a very good question. Why? Why did they sacrifice? And, we could sort of think of this passage as the origin story for sacrifice, except it doesn't tell us where it came from. Sacrifice wasn't invented. It's not like, it doesn't say Cain and Abel sat down together and say, how should we fill our day today? Let's offer something to the Lord. It sounds good. Nobody sort of put thought into it and decided to do it. In fact, sacrifice is just sort of assumed. Sort of and it happened after some days that Cain and Abel brought sacrifices, as you do. This is just what people do. Nobody told them to do it. Adam and Eve didn't instruct them to do it. God didn't even verbally instruct them to do it. So where did it come from? Well, the church fathers explain this, actually several church fathers, Cyril of Alexandria, John Chrysostom, and Ambrose of Milan, to name a few, all point to this passage and the assumption of sacrifice as indicating that sacrifice is an innate drive that God has planted into human beings. That it's something natural to us. That God has planted in us this thought that we need to make some offering to Him in return for all the blessings that He gives us. It's just something natural that God has put into us. And here's St. Cyril of Alexandria's quote. He says, a law of innate knowledge of God, which is within all of us, summoned these men, he's talking about Cain and Abel, to the necessity of offering up thank offerings to the Creator of all, God who gives us every good thing. So sacrifice is something implanted in us by God. And if we ask ourselves, well, why would God put that drive in us? Certainly it's not because he has some need for sacrifice, right? God doesn't need anything. He's not looking for that smoke in order to sort of sustain him. It's not like nutrition for God, because God doesn't need nutrition. He doesn't, in fact, need our praise. Like God is not some sort of self-absorbed narcissist, heavenly narcissist who needs people to constantly praise him and show him attention. So why did God put that need in us, or put that drive in us? Well, like all of his gifts, it's not for him, it's for us. And so he put into us the logic of friend-making gifts applied to him so that we would have a means to reach out to him and connect to him. A means that makes sense to us in a worldly way, right? So God doesn't need the gifts, but we need the gifts. We need to give the gifts so that we can express that love and welcome to him. So that we can have a free relationship of love towards him. Because again, God could have just turned us into robots or zombies and, who worship him out of necessity. But he gave us free will because he wants to have true fellowship, true friendship with us, and that requires freedom, right? We have to, in order to be friends, in order to love, you have to have the freedom not to be friends or not to love. It has to be a free choice, or else it's not a real relationship. So, God put into us, though, this way that we could connect to him who is so far beyond us that, we might just sort of feel at a loss of how we could reach out to him. But he gave us this hint, this thought planted in our minds, that we can connect to God by giving him offerings, by making offerings to him. And in fact, we should, out of gratitude and in order to foster that relationship with him. So sacrifice is something natural to human beings. We see that at the very beginning in Cain and Abel. And then, as I've described earlier, we see it throughout the world. At the time of the Bible, all cultures throughout the world were offering sacrifices. And where did that come from? It came from Cain and Abel, and it came, in fact, before them, from that thought, that natural thought that God planted in human minds. So here's a question: why was Cain's offering rejected? So we have this distinction, these two brothers who make their own offerings, and one is rejected, Cain's, and one is accepted, Abel's. Abel's offering is an offering of animals, offering of meat. Cain's was an offering of vegetables. And so, actually, growing up, I don't even know if I was ever taught this, but I sort of assumed that God accepted Abel's offering because he prefers animal offerings. And because giving plants to God just isn't good enough. And so we have a cartoon here that represents that way of thinking. Cain is there. Hey, God, it's Cain. My sacrifice is still vegetables, but now I've cleverly shaped them like an animal. However, let's think about that a little bit more carefully. Because, as I've mentioned, God not only accepted but commanded vegetable offerings in Leviticus, right? Grain, milky seeds, olive oil, wine. These things are, from vegetable sources, and God accepts them in the same way he accepts animal offerings. And he nowhere says that those are lesser kinds of offerings. So this thinking that's reflected here that I grew up with is really a mistaken assumption based on our modern idea of sacrifice, because we think sacrifice has to have bloodshed or it just isn't good enough. That wasn't the case in the ancient world. That's not how ancient people thought, and that's not what's written in the Bible. But what is the difference? Why was Cain's offering not good enough? Here's a quote from St. Ambrose of Milan, interpreting this passage. He says, "One of the brothers, that is Cain, offered the Lord a sacrifice from the fruits of the land, and the other, namely Abel, offered one of the firstborn of his flocks. I find no complaint to make as to the kind of gifts." Now, why did Cain offer plants? Why did he offer produce?
Because he was a farmer.
Because he was a farmer. That's what he had, right? Why did Abel offer a sheep? Because he was a shepherd. That's what he had. And we can only offer what we have, right? So that's the reason for the gifts, and there's no problem with the kind of gifts. That's what St. Ambrose says. So where then is the crime? Where the fault? Not in the offering of the gift, but in the disposition of the mind with which the offering is made. There are some who rightly think that one, namely Abel, had carefully selected what he should offer, whereas the other, Cain, offered the cheaper things that he had. This is precisely how John Chrysostom and Cyril of Alexandria and all of the church fathers really interpret this passage. That the problem was that Cain was careless in what he chose to give God out of his possessions, whereas Abel was very careful to select the very best to give God. Now, where are they getting this from? Is this just sort of assumptions that they're making based on how they think it should be read? No. It's written right there in the text of Genesis. Cain brought a sacrifice from the fruits of the earth. He just brought whatever was there. But with Abel brought not just a sacrifice from his flock, but the firstborn and from their suet. So from the fattest firstborn that he could find, the best lamb that he had. He carefully selected what was the best. You know, why the firstborn? The firstborn is just, in ancient thinking, is always the best. And then the fattest animal is the best. So Abel selected the best, whereas Cain just brought something, whatever he had. And we can sort of assume from that, since it doesn't specify the best, that Cain sort of said, well, here's a big, ripe watermelon. And I think that belongs in my belly. But I have some carrots over there that are a little shriveled and maybe got some spots on them and whatever. God doesn't care, just give those to him. Because God doesn't eat anyway, right? What does God need my carrots for? I'm just going to burn them and, who cares? So Cain did not put careful thought into what he was offering. But that undermined the symbolism. Right? Imagine when you give gifts to someone, what if you Christmas is coming and you're like, oh, I'm too busy, I've got TV to watch, I've got, my hobbies to look after, I've got my work to do. And then the day before Christmas, you're like, oh no, I need a present. So you're looking around the house and you're like, oh, I've got some spare socks in the drawer, and you know what I mean, and I've got, this broom I've only been using it for a couple of years, and you wrapped them up and you gave them to someone. That's not a very good gift, because it's thoughtless. In fact, it's offensive. It's sort of an anti-gift. It becomes, instead of a representation of your regard for the other person, of your sort of relational invitation and commitment and wanting to connect to them, it's sort of like, you don't really matter to me. That's what it means when you don't carefully select the gift. And so, St. Cyril of Alexandria points out, look at the last verse. It said that God accepts Abel and his gifts, but he disregarded Cain and his, not gifts, sacrifices. Cyril of Alexandria points out that Abel's offering was worthy of the name gift because he carefully selected it, because of the thought that he put in it. It's the thought that counts. It's the thought he put into it makes it a gift. But Cain didn't actually offer a gift. He just offered a mere sacrifice that didn't rise to the level of a gift. So this careless offering of Cain actually becomes the original sin of sacrifice. I'll explain what I mean by that, but the original sin of sacrifice. So this Genesis 4, 6 through 7 follows on what we read before. After God rejects Cain's offering, Cain becomes upset. But God comes to him and says, the Lord God said to Cain, "Why did you become morose, sad? And why is your face downcast? When you offer rightly, but do not apportion rightly, do you not sin?" So here in how God sort of addresses Cain, and look at his kindness, like he's trying to coach him. He's trying to say, okay, like you made a mistake, but here's the lesson you can learn from that, and maybe you can do better, right? When you offer right, so the fact that he gave an offering, that's right. You offered rightly, but you did not apportion rightly. So what does apportioning rightly mean? It means that God should always be given our best to show that he's the most important one to us. When you save the best for yourself and you give God the second best, that means that you are the most important thing to yourself, not God. It undermines the relational significance of the sacrifice. We can also point out like another problem in Cain's mentality. So Cain was stingy. And why are people stingy? Because they're afraid. They're afraid that there won't be enough left for them, right? So, I don't want to give too much money to the poor because what if I end up not having enough for myself? It's that fear, and specifically a fear that God will not provide. So it's a lack of trust. So this mentality of saving the best for yourself and sort of hoarding the best for yourself and only giving God the leftovers, it is a representation of a refusal to trust God. Whereas that sort of generous spirit of giving God the best, it also involves trusting that, you know what, God's going to provide for me. Sort of like if I'm faithful to give to God as he's commanded and asked of me, then he's going to provide for me and I won't be left in the lurch. But Cain's mentality was that mentality of stinginess. And really sort of coming to the relationship with God in an adversarial way as opposed to an open way. Sort of seeing God as this competition. So I have these things and I have to give God some things and then I don't have for myself. So maybe, I can sort of manipulate this situation in order to hold on to that sense of control and, make sure that God doesn't get the better of me. As opposed to Abel's mentality, the faithful mentality, which says, everything that I am and have comes from God, and I would willingly give it all to him. Like I'm not going to withhold anything from him. It's that openness of trust in relationship, which sets the stage for truly having communion with God. It's that perfect openness that we sort of see as the ideal of marriage. I mean, it's the same thing, husband and wife who withhold nothing from each other, who are completely given over to the needs and the care and the interests of the other person. That's another example of that perfect openness and trusting communion, which in this case, God wants from us. But Cain's mentality, that mentality that God is a competitor, that God is trying to take advantage of me, that I need to protect myself and see to my interests so that I don't lose out. That is the original sin of sacrifice. Cain's mentality there planted the seed that distorted all human religion afterwards. So all human religion afterwards follows that trajectory that Cain sets, where God is seen as, an object to be manipulated, as a competitor for attention and resources, someone that is very powerful and that I need to somehow have some mastery over so that he doesn't hurt me, but also someone who I can't trust to take care of me. So after Cain's sin, humanity, the human idea of God and human religion goes astray. First and foremost, the one God is sort of the knowledge of the one God is fragmented into this pantheon of many gods. The division of divinity into these sort of separate and competing divine entities, because when you read mythology, it's all about how this god is trying to get over on this god, and what it humanizes the idea of the divine. Really, ancient Greek mythology is a heavenly soap opera, if you've ever read it. I mean, it's all the worst things about human relationships projected onto the divine, which is a way of sort of like diminishing God and also thinking of God as being capable of being manipulated, which again, that's another theme throughout Greek mythology. So in Greek mythology, the work of the worshiper is to navigate this divine soap opera in order to, first of all, not get destroyed, but then also to try to take advantage of it for his or her own benefit. And sacrifice fits right into that, because sacrifice becomes this way of earning favor. We talked about propitiation versus expiation. Earning favor with the gods so that you can at least prevent them from hurting you and maybe, get some blessings out of them. Now, to contrast the vision of God, the distorted vision of God, and specifically of sacrifice that developed in paganism with the vision that we have in Holy Scripture, consider two origin stories of sacrifice from pagan cultures. First of all, the Mesopotamian myth of Atrahasis. If any of you are familiar, Atrahasis is actually, his story is like the story of Noah in Genesis, in the sense that the gods decided that they were going to destroy the human race, and so they sent a flood, and Atrahasis was the one who escaped the flood with his family in an ark. So the Mesopotamians had this myth, but all of the details are changed and warped. So this Mesopotamian story begins with the idea that the gods created human beings in order to grow food for them, because the gods were too lazy to do the work themselves. So they created human beings to be their workers. But human beings were raising this food and sort of realized, oh, we have some power over the gods because they need this food that we're producing. And so it becomes this labor dispute, right? Where the workers start to feel their power and the management gets afraid. And so the gods, the management, they decide to send the flood because they're like, we don't need this hassle, just kill all the people. Atrahasis somehow manages to escape. But after this flood has wiped out the human race, the gods, after 40 days and 40 nights, they start to get hungry. They're like, oh man, what have we done? And then they command the flood to diminish, and they tell Atrahasis, okay, you can stay around as long as you keep sending food to us as sacrifices. And that was, for the Mesopotamians, the origin story of sacrifice. Well, think about how different that is from what we see with Cain and Abel. Where Cain and Abel are sort of led naturally to present a gift of gratitude to God, which he doesn't demand from them, but it's an open and, kind gift of generosity towards him, which he accepts and which draws them together. Instead, we have this labor dispute, which is all about manipulation. It's about competition for resources, and it leads to really a division between divinity and humanity, as opposed to, with Cain and Abel, the possibility of bringing humanity together with divinity. Another similar story, but this time from the Greeks, the trick at Mycenae. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the trick at Mycenae. So, this is a story told by Hesiod, the ancient poet around the time of Homer, who tells this story of a time when the gods and human beings were together in fellowship, and they would eat together. And one day, when they were going to have a meal, they decide, they talk about how they're going to divide the cow that's slaughtered between them. So they're slaughtering a calf, and they're debating how to divide the calf between them. Which part are the gods going to get, and which part are the human beings going to get? Prometheus, who's a titan, who's actually always humanity's champion. Prometheus is the one that snuck fire down from the heavens and gave human beings fire. That's another myth. But here, Prometheus steps forward and he tries to help humanity in another way. He says, Zeus, if you'll allow me, I'll make this a little easier for you. I'm going to divide the cow into 2 portions, and then you can choose whichever one you want, and humanity will take whatever is left. And Zeus said, okay, sounds like a good idea. So Prometheus slaughters the cow, and he takes the bones of the cow and wraps them in the suet, the rich fat. So there's like a rich layer of fat, and inside are just the bones. And then the meat he takes and puts that in the stomach of the cow. And so he brings this to Zeus, and Zeus looks and he sees this rich, tantalizing ball of fat on one hand. On the other hand, it's like this stomach lining, like this fat, plump stomach lining. He says, I'll take the fat. And Prometheus says, fine. And ever since then, Hesiod says, Greeks have burnt the bones of the animal and the fat on the altar, but kept the meat for themselves. So that's how Hesiod explains how Greeks practice sacrifice. But again, a very different idea. It's all about trickery. It's about manipulation. It's about competition for resources, that humanity has to see to its own needs and its own welfare, because the gods otherwise are going to take advantage of them. Very different idea from what we get with Cain and Abel. And certainly a reflection of Cain's mentality rather than righteous Abel's mentality. And so as human religion sort of continues on this crooked course, we get even to the point of human sacrifices. As if God would be pleased by the death of human beings as opposed to animals. This is something that God does not countenance. He doesn't allow it. In fact, he strictly prohibits it in the Old Testament. And it's actually was a very rare practice in the ancient world, but it did occur. It's sort of like the ultimate distortion of the idea of sacrifice, the idea that in order to win God over, we have to kill one of our fellow men. So, we've charted a course from Cain and that mistake he had, which, by the way, God gave him a chance to change, but what did he do instead? He killed his brother Abel because he could not, in humility, repent. In his pride, he says, well, Abel he's envious of Abel's acceptance, and so he kills his brother Abel, and of course, then that is the original sin of human relationships, where humanity ever since then has been in competition with each other, rather than in open, caring fellowship with each other. So we see like the original sin of religion in Cain's sacrifice, and we see the original sin of society in Cain's fratricide after that. And from there, it just gets worse and worse and worse until God intervenes. And actually, this is not something that sort of haphazardly happened at a point in time, but from the very beginning, he prepared the ground to eventually introduce a purified script for divine human relationship. He chose, Noah, he chose Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He chose faithful people throughout these ages in order to prepare a people for him to whom he would give the law. The law which was given through Moses. The law which was, as I just said, a purified script for human divine relationship. So the law includes practices that were found throughout the world. So it doesn't invent practices. So as I said, sacrifice was practiced throughout the world, and it's found in the law. Incense was burned in worship throughout the world, as in the law. There were houses of worship throughout the world, and there's a house of worship in the law. So the religion that's found in the law of Moses is not a completely new invention. What it is a purification of the forms of human religion, which, as I said, go back to the creation of Adam and Eve and the implanting in them of this knowledge of how to relate to God, which was then distorted through sin, and then in the law of Moses, God says, no, this is how you should approach me through sacrifices and in worship generally. The law of Moses included a requirement that all other religions be excluded from the land of Israel. This was so that the people of Israel wouldn't be sidetracked from the purified forms that God was giving them. And so Exodus 34, 13 through 17, you will demolish their altars, talking about the pagans of the land of Palestine where the Israelites were going. You will demolish their altars, shatter their religious pillars, cut down their sacred groves, and burn their gods' carved images with fire, lest you make a covenant to dwell near foreigners upon the land, and they go whoring after their gods, and sacrifice to their gods, and invite you, and you eat their sacrifices. So what's happening? well, I'll explain this again. You eat their sacrifices and receive their daughters for your sons, and give your daughters to their sons, and your daughters go whoring after their gods, and your sons go whoring after their gods. So, allowing those pagan scripts of religious practices to remain in the land risked the people of Israel being sucked back into those deviant practices through the relationships that they would naturally have with their neighbors. So God says you have to completely wipe it out and create this land, this ideal land, where only the forms of religion as I give them to you will be practiced. I will say that the law of Moses is an ideal that was never fulfilled. It's very interesting. We think of the law of Moses and all of its intricacies, but the history of the Old Testament is how the people of Israel were continually falling short of these practices. So it's important to keep that in mind, that what's described in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is an ideal that God has given them, but it doesn't represent what they actually did. So what changed? What is the purified form that God gave in the law of Moses? First of all, and this is hugely different from pagan religion, there was to be only one site of worship, only one place where sacrifice could be done. A singular site of sacrifice. So among the pagans, there were sacrifices everywhere. There were temples, there were shrines. In one city there might be temples to many gods, and in fact, multiple temples to the same god. Likewise, sacrifices took place in people's homes, and they had their own little idols in their homes, and they had an altar in their homes, and they would offer sacrifice to their idols in their homes. So these sacrifices were everywhere, and that and those temples and shrines, you have to keep in mind, were thought of as the dwelling places of the gods. So there was a building in which the god's statue was, and that statue represented the god actually living in that building. And that building was considered the home of the god. But think about it. If you have all of these homes for gods, all of those temples represent the diversity of all these different gods. And they all have different characteristics. And you go in one temple and the god's dressed like this, and he has, serpents coming out of his head, and he has a lightning bolt in his hand. You go to the other one, and he has, some other features, or so the multiplicity of sites of worship in paganism was a symbol of the multiplicity of gods. But in the religion of the law, God emphasized over and over again that he is one, that he is singular. And so the fact that there would be only one place that he commanded all sacrifice must take place. This one place would be his home, he says, where I dwell among you. It represented the fact that there is only one God. So one temple represents that there's one God, only one God. A well-ordered priesthood, I can't really get into the details, but in paganism, just in general in paganism, it was sort of like the Wild West, that anything goes, so in the law, everything was carefully regulated so that the priesthood would operate in a way that reflected honor upon God, and that led the people to be closer to God. Finely tuned ritual requirements. I mentioned that the law is very specific on what kind of things can be offered to God. They have to be those domesticated animals or domestic agricultural produce. They have to be without blemish. And another requirement that I just mentioned before, the sacrifices had to be properly produced or purchased. They couldn't be stolen. Or they couldn't be gained by unrighteous means. So even by repression, like, someone who abuses his position in order to take advantage of other people, that would invalidate his sacrifice from the goods. Like, or if he's because the sacrifice had to represent a personal investment, like sweat equity in your relationship with God. But all of these finely tuned ritual requirements made sure that the gifts had the proper symbolism. In paganism, you had certain places where, the village would set up a big bonfire and people would run around ecstatically throwing live snakes onto the bonfire, and that was their sacrifice. To Hebrews, that's just like, it's not just weird, but it's like, why would God be pleased by that? And those practices reflect an understanding of God which is deficient. And so the ritual requirements exclude all of those sort of wacky, human-generated, deficient practices that distort the human-divine relationship. And finally, a clear code of conduct. So the law, which also stipulates what kind of behavior is required of people, in addition to the worship that's required. It's interesting that really in pagan religion, there was not a concept of sin. Sin is something that really originated in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So originated from the revelation that's contained in the scriptures. Morality was much more of a matter of personal choice amongst pagans, as opposed to divine prescriptions. So there's the fact that we have the Ten Commandments and all of the strict regulations of human conduct in a religious context is something particular to the law of Moses. All right. Types of Mosaic sacrifice. There were different types of Mosaic sacrifice which reflected different motives. I'm kind of going to breeze through these because we don't have a lot of time. But three main types: whole burnt offerings, peace offerings, and sin offerings. Whole burnt offerings were offerings in which the entire offering basically was burnt on the altar. So all of the food that was offered was burnt on the altar. So the whole animal was burnt on the altar, but after, of course, as I said before, it was skinned and divided into pieces of meat and salted. So it was still representative of food. So why would one, in this case, burn everything, the whole gift on the altar? What would that represent? Total devotion to God. Total devotion to God. It's sort of like the most lavish and generous gift. It's as if you invited someone to your house and you had a whole table full of food and you just had them sit down and you just served them the food and you didn't sit down with them. Now, that'd be awkward for us, but we can see how it's a dramatic demonstration of complete devotion. And that's what the whole burnt offering was for. It was a demonstration of complete devotion to God, rededicating one's whole life to God, again, in the context of those qualities that we described before: obedience, harmlessness, fruitfulness, and lack of defect. Promising those things, but what's added is that total devotion, that wholeness of devotion. And whole burnt offerings were offered just at various times, at regular intervals, and then offered by individuals when they wanted to sort of to demonstrate again their total devotion to God. In certain cases, it might be prompted by their realization that even though they didn't do anything wrong, they still hadn't been doing enough right things. So sins of omission could be sort of the prompt to bringing this gift of a whole burnt offering to God. A demonstration that, look, I'm recommitting myself to be totally devoted to you. The second type of offering is the peace offering, and there are different variations there. I won't go into the variations, the subtypes. But the peace offering in general was an offering of gratitude on various occasions when God had done something good for the worshiper. So it had nothing to do with sin. A peace offering was a kind of sacrifice where a person was celebrating God's blessings. And so would bring the offering, and in this case, part of the food would be burnt on the altar, the best parts. Then the second best parts would be distributed to the priests. And then the remainder, actually the bulk of the food, would be returned to the people for those celebratory feasts. So that feast would be a continuance of that celebration of God's blessings. And it's not just sort of retrospective thanks, but also asking God to come even closer to the person and grant even more blessings. So it's sort of like, God, let the good times roll. Like let's keep developing this relationship. And then finally, the sin offering. Sin offerings were in the cases when a person realized that they had sinned and disrupted their relationship with God. And in these cases, the best portions of the food offering were burnt on the altar, and the remainder was eaten usually by the priests. Only in certain occasions when the priest was one of the people who sinned, then he couldn't eat the offering. It all had to be burnt up. But usually if like an individual offered a sin offering, then the priest would eat it. And this represented a rededication of one's life to that quality of life that God seeks from us. And you might ask, well, why does the individual not eat of it? Because he can't benefit from, it's sort of like, it wouldn't make sense for him to benefit from his apology offering. And in a sense, he's fasting from his sacrifice as a demonstration of his repentance and his humility. Now, why doesn't all of it get burnt up, like in a whole burnt offering? In a sense, we could say maybe that's God's humility, that he's not making a big deal about the sin. And instead of, having it be this lavish display of burning all this meat on the altar, just a portion of it is burnt so that God sort of like humbly accepts, I accept your apology, it's okay, no big deal, no problem, that kind of spirit. And then it's eaten by the priest because when the priest receives that gift from the people, he actually sort of becomes morally indebted to them to pray for them. And when he receives it as God's agent, showing God's acceptance. So anyway, there's symbolism in each of these details that's specific to the type of sacrifice. But I will say that all of these offerings had the same basic outline, which we're going to go over in a second. It's just that each one was different in terms of the final procedures of offering. Just little tweaks that identified the distinctive characteristics of that type of offering. Okay, structure of Mosaic animal sacrifice. I'm going to try to breeze through this. I've talked about some elements before, and I'll kind of bring them all together here. So the ritual of sacrifice involves several steps, which are outlined in the book of Leviticus. It starts with selecting and preserving proper gifts. So you need to have an unblemished gift to bring to God, which is not easy to have an unblemished gift, because remember, any animal that had an injury, or that had an infection, or that had anything wrong with it couldn't be offered. Well, if you have an infection come into your flock, it's going to naturally spread to the whole flock, right? Or if you are careless with your animals, they're going to trip and fall and break their legs or what have you. So the offerer, in order to have those gifts to offer, even before he goes to the temple, has to be careful to find the most perfect animals and then to protect them. And to say, look, this is something that I'm going to give to God, so I need to put some work into tending it and protecting it and keeping it safe. So there's a lot of intention that goes into this preparation. And then on the other hand, there's preparation having to do with themselves. They have to attain a state of ritual purity, which involves avoiding those certain things that represent worldly life. And if you can't avoid them, then at least to go through a ritual that symbolically distances you from them by waiting a certain period of time and then doing a symbolic washing in order to distance yourself from those elements of worldly life. So first, the gift has to be prepared and the individual has to prepare himself. Next come the preliminaries. These are the introductory parts of the offering that set the stage for the most important elements which come under the title Procedures of Offering. These preliminaries are all done by the offerer. So the offerer is the one who actually physically does these things. First, presenting the offering before the Lord. So he brings the offering and he shows the gift to the Lord. And remember, showing the gift to the Lord is an important part because you're showing God these physical qualities that are symbolic of what you're committing to Him. Okay, so showing the offering to the Lord, pressing one's hand on the animal's head, which symbolizes that this is an animal that belongs to me and that represents me. Slaughtering the animal and collecting its blood. So in order to obtain the blood and the meat, which are necessary for the offering, you have to kill the animal in a specific way, cutting its neck so that you can collect all that blood, which is so richly symbolic. And then finally, dressing the animal carcass and salting its meat. So skinning the animal, dividing it into pieces of meat, and then salting the meat. And then come the procedures of offering, and these things are all done by the priests, which is a hint for us that shows that these are the most important things. These are the holiest acts, the focus of the ritual. Sort of the earlier parts can be done by the amateurs, but these things have to be done by the ritual experts, the priests. Number one, carrying the blood forward, presenting it. This is another thing. So the blood has to be shown to God. So the animal is shown to God, the blood comes from it, the blood is shown to God. Hey, this is the blood that came from that animal that had those qualities. And then the blood is applied to the altar in order to prepare it with that symbolic meaning, prepare the meal with the symbolic meaning. Bringing the meat forward and burning all or part of it on the altar. This is also the time when the other food that was presented would be burned on the altar. The wine would be poured out at the base of the altar by the priests. And then finally, the consumption of the remaining meat by the priests and sometimes by the worshipers according to the type of sacrifice. So again, all of this was the same for sin offerings, whole burnt offerings, and peace offerings, except for in the procedures of offering. So where the blood was placed was one of the distinctives that separated the different types of offering. What was burned on the altar, that distinguished the different types of the offerings. And then who consumed what after the fact. Those are the three things where you find differences between the types of offerings, and those differences identify the specific intentions of those types. Okay, so a very elaborate and intricate system that didn't work. So it ended up not being effective for restoring the relationship of the people of Israel with God. And so we end up in the prophets who came sometime after, centuries after the law was established with Moses. These prophets, in certain places, speak the word of God where he seems to reject, even almost seems to reject the idea of sacrifice, and it becomes a little perplexing. So here's one example. God says through Isaiah, "The lawless one who sacrifices a calf to me is like one who kills a dog. And he who offers semolina is like an offer of pig blood. He who gives incense for memorial is like a blasphemer." So, one who kills a dog, pig's blood, blasphemer. God is saying, like people bringing sacrifice, I loathe them. They disgust me. This is strange because God is the one in Leviticus who told them to do it. So what is he disgusted with? Did he change his mind? Did he sort of like wake up one morning and say, hey, I don't like these sacrifices after all? No. God doesn't change. He doesn't change his mind. We have to continue reading and we'll get a sense of why those particular people who were sacrificing at that time, why God was rejecting their sacrifices. He says, "These people have chosen their own ways and their abominations, which they desired. I called them, and they did not obey me. I spoke, and they did not listen. And they did evil before me and chose that which I did not desire." And, of course, if we go back to the very beginning, who is he talking about? He's talking about the lawless one who offers sacrifice. Not the righteous one who offers sacrifice, but the lawless one who offers sacrifice. So the problem here is that the ritual forms themselves are emptied of meaning if people do not follow through with the commitments that they're making, with the symbolism, the meaning of the sacrifice. So if you bring to God a gift of an animal that is obedient, harmless, fruitful, and unblemished, and then you leave and you live a disobedient, harmful, fruitless, and blemished life, who cares about your offering? Really, the comparison that I can make that maybe we can all grasp onto is imagine a husband and a wife where the husband commits adultery. And after committing adultery, he feels bad about it, so he confesses to his wife, and he, brings her some flowers and chocolates and says, "I'm sorry, I did this, I betrayed you." Now maybe, I don't know if flowers and chocolates cut it, but maybe if she's really good-hearted, she'll say, "Okay, I understand. Let's work on our relationship. Let's have a better relationship." Okay, so the gift has meaning because what do flowers and chocolates represent? Sort of that sweetness and that kind regard and that desire to please. All of those kind of good feelings that they represent. Now imagine the same husband, a few weeks later, goes out and commits adultery again. And then he feels bad, and he brings the flowers and chocolates. I don't know if the wife is going to forgive him again. Maybe if she's really long-suffering, she'll forgive him again. And then a few weeks later, he goes out and does the same thing. And then, of course, he's not feeling sorry because, as my mother said, sorry is as sorry does. But he thinks, well, maybe I can keep things going, the appearance of things going, by bringing this flowers and chocolates and just keep bringing the flowers. Eventually, his wife is going to say, "Keep the flowers and chocolates. They mean nothing to me. In fact, they disgust me. Because every time you sin, you bring these, and then you keep doing it." This is how God came to feel about the sacrifices. It's not that the rituals were wrong. It's that they were emptied of meaning because there was no follow-through. There was no follow-up. A commitment was being symbolically made through these offerings, and the people were not living up to it. They weren't actually cultivating. They were inviting God into a relationship that they then disregarded. Micah 6:6-8. With what will I reach the Lord and lay hold of my God Most High? Will I reach him with whole burnt offerings? With year-old calves? Will the Lord accept me by means of thousands of rams or 10,000s of fat goats, a very lavish sacrifice? Should I give my firstborn as a result of my ungodliness, the fruit of my womb for the sake of the sin of my soul? No, these are rhetorical questions. What good thing has been proclaimed to you, O man, or what does the Lord seek from you, except to do justice and to love mercy and to be willing to walk with the Lord your God? So here the point is being made, not that the rituals are bad, but that they're insufficient. That the rituals were there as sort of an entree into a life of faithfulness to God. As a means of sort of like initiating that relationship. Just like those friend-making gifts, like would initiate a relationship. But what was necessary in order to really draw close to God, to be accepted by him, was to do justice, to love mercy, and to be willing to walk with the Lord your God, to actually live faithfully towards God. And so St. Irenaeus of Lyon in this 2nd century says about sacrifice, if anyone shall endeavor to offer a sacrifice merely according to outward appearance, unexceptionably in due order, and according to appointment, so properly, while in his soul he does not assign to his neighbor that fellowship with him which is right and proper, nor is under the fear of God. So this one doesn't love God and his neighbor as God commanded. He who thus cherishes secret sin does not deceive God by that sacrifice which is offered correctly only as to outward appearance. Nor will such an oblation profit him anything, but only the giving up of that evil which has been conceived within him. It is the conscience of the offerer that sanctifies the sacrifice when it is pure. So the conscience is what gives meaning and significance to the sacrifice, and thus moves God to accept the offering as from a friend. So the conscience is that intention, that firm intention to be good to God, to be a good friend to God. And that's what makes the sacrifice holy, not the legalistic forms. And of course, so that was the problem with Mosaic sacrifice, is that the people of Israel disregarded and didn't live up to the spirit of the law, but were instead simply focused on the forms of the law, which when you think about it, the forms of the law are a lot easier than the spirit of the law. To love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, that's a lifelong project that requires all of our attention. Whereas offering a sacrifice is something that you could do in a matter of a few days. So since the law could not change hearts, the Lord has prepared his own sacrifice. So the weakness of the law, the problem with the law was not that the rituals were bad. The problem was that it was unable to change the human heart. That it was unable to prepare was unable to make the person follow through on those pledges that he was making. And so they became just empty gestures because human sin undermined the law's ability to bring us closer to God. All right, so that is the problem with the law, and then of course next we're going to go to the solution, which is found in Christ. We're really late.
Father, why don't we just keep on going till you finish, and then after the last lecture and before Vespers, we'll have time to have more coffee and refreshments before coming to Vespers at 5 p.m.
Okay.
So, are you about to start your fourth lecture, by the way? Are we at that point? Well, let's just stand together, stretch your legs.